Villa Park, home of Aston Villa Football Club, one of the most successful clubs in English football history. They've been champions of England's top flight 7 times and have reached the FA Cup final 10 times, winning on 7 of those occasions. One of their greatest achievements was in 1982 when they beat Bayern Munich 1-0 to win the European Cup, now the Champions League. Villa have a whole host of stars in their history. Charlie Aitken, a Scottish international, played a record 660 games from 1961 to 1976. Other Villa stars include Brian Little, who played as a midfielder or striker from 1972 to 79. His incredible balance and pace could leave players standing. Former club captain Gareth Southgate is Villa's most capped player, having played 57 times for England. He played for Villa from 1995 to 2001. And this is the building where it all began, the Aston Villa Wesleyan Chapel. That chapel has gone now, and what's in its place is the red brick building that we see opposite. However, next door, this red brick building was the original Bible class attended by some 300 young students. One of the classes was run by a man called Henry Hartshorn, and his Bible class was the cradle of Aston Villa Football Club. In fact, they formed a cricket team here from that Bible class called Aston Villa Wesleyan Cricket Team. Significantly, 4 of those members, and their names were Jack Hughes, Frederick Matthews, William Scattergood, Walter Price. Those 4 were delegated to watch a football match that was taking place up the road round here in Heathfield Road. They were keen to see what its potential was for themselves. The game that they saw was a little bit too physical for their liking, so they came here to Villa Cross and stood under a lamppost, we're told, somewhere on this site, to discuss what they'd seen and to suggest what they should report back to the others. And they felt that the game they ought to consider was this new one, only 11 years old, called association football, which was far less physical than the form of the game they'd seen, which was more like rugby. And so they reported back, and it was decided that they would form a football club. And the name given was Aston Villa Wesleyan Football Club. And that decision was taken in February 1874 here at Villa Cross. By the way, the name Villa Cross comes from the fact that on this site here stood a former Georgian villa which gave its name to many of the streets in the locality and, of course, to the Aston Villa Wesleyan Chapel, which stood over there. One of those 4 players, Jack Hughes, achieved immortality by becoming the first goal scorer in Aston Villa's history. That was a month after the meeting here at Villa Cross, when Aston Villa Wesleyan Football Club played another local team, Aston Brookes St Mary's, in a 15-a-side game, half the game according to rugby rules, half the game according to association football rules, because there weren't at that time many teams that played association football. The game was won 1-0 and Jack Hughes became the scorer. This impressive building is Aston Hall, the home of Sir Thomas Holt, who started building it in 1618. He's commemorated very visibly at the home end of Villa Park, which is just across the road from Aston Park, the former deer park of Aston Hall. It became known as the Football Nursery of Birmingham. And here, in the 1875-76 season, Villa started to take their football seriously and played a full programme of fixtures. But they also practised here. And one particular spring morning in 1876, a young man from Scotland came across these lads playing and asked if he could join in. His name was George Ramsey, a 20-year-old Glaswegian who'd come to Birmingham in search of work. He so mesmerised these Villa players with his dazzling skills that they immediately said, "Come and join us." And he did. and it was an association that was to last for the rest of his life. Under George Ramsay's inspired leadership, Aston Villa went from strength to strength, and it was pretty obvious they needed a home of their own if they were going to develop. After all, they were sharing Aston Park with so many other local teams. The opportunity for real growth came when one Sunday afternoon, George Ramsay and his friend Jemmy Lindsay were taking a stroll out in the countryside at Perry Bar, here. And they came across some grazing land which they thought would be absolutely ideal for a football pitch. And they negotiated with the owner, and it was agreed that they could hire this land. And it became the Perry Bar ground. Villa's fame began to spread, and word of this club reached a Scotsman called William Mcgregor, who'd heard that not only was this a good club, one worth watching, but also that there were many other Scotsmen there, and he was immediately drawn to meet them. He came to Perry Bar, he met George Ramsay, they became firm friends, and Ramsay persuaded him to become a member of Aston Villa Football Club. A year later, at McGregor's suggestion, the Scottish national symbol of the lion rampant was adopted as the club's emblem. In fact, one of Aston Villa's nicknames today is the Lions. At the time, the club's headquarters was the old Crown and Cushion Coaching Inn. Not exactly the best choice when you realise that a lot of those players like their drink. Some of them failed to turn up for training, some turned up to matches completely drunk. And so it was McGregor, who was now on board, and a lifelong teetotaler, who decided something drastic had to be done. And he compelled those players to attend a social evening where they listened to musical performances on Monday evenings as a way of instilling good habits into them. And it seemed to work, because not too long afterwards, this club really started to achieve big things. So who was William Mcgregor? He was born in Perthshire in January 1846, his early years being spent in the picturesque village of Braco. He was baptised here in the parish church in the village. While quite young, he and his family moved north to Perth, where he trained as an apprentice draper. Then, at the age of 24, he moved south to Birmingham, where he opened his own draper's shop on this site, working here for the rest of his life. When William Mcgregor came to Birmingham in 1870, he immediately associated himself with the Wheeler Street Congregational Chapel, which stood here on this site. He was here for 40 years. It was his church until the day he died. In fact, his pastor, W.G. Percival, said of McGregor that beyond all else in his life, the most important thing was his Christian faith. He in fact described him as a man of absolutely unblemished character, something that was echoed by many people in the world of football afterwards. Another important landmark in McGregor's life in Birmingham is here in Alma Street, on this very unlikely site. In fact, it's also one of the most important locations in the history of football. Let me tell you about it. It all started in 1880 when Villa won their first trophy, the Birmingham Senior Cup. From that time, the club just got bigger and bigger. And in fact, they started to pay their players loss of earnings if they'd taken time off from factories to play, and also expenses. This was totally against the purest amateur spirit of the day. And in fact, in 1884, McGregor actually stood up at a very important meeting involving the Football Association and courageously declared that they, among others, were actually paying players for loss of earnings and for expenses. A year later, professionalism was legalised, and Villa took the opportunity to turn professional. But this presented its own problems, because now the club was totally dependent on income from gates to generate the money they needed to pay the players. And this meant they had to be sure that there will be good gates generated from playing against good teams. But unfortunately, this didn't always happen. Very often, a team would turn up with too few players and would have to enlist spectators to make up the numbers, or if they found attractive opposition elsewhere, they just wouldn't bother turning up. All of these sorts of situations made spectators reluctant to go to matches because they didn't know if they'd have a game to watch. And with these declining gates, there became real problems for clubs who had to pay their players. And it was such a serious problem that one winter's evening in 1886, here in Joe Tillotson's coffee house, Joe Tillotson was a very close friend of McGregor, they discussed the situation. And McGregor hit upon the idea that what was needed was what he called a fixity of fixtures, where clubs could be sure that matches would take place. And his idea was that a group of clubs should agree to play each other on a home and away basis on fixed dates for points. It was the birth of the idea of the Football League. With this in mind, McGregor then started to sound out opinion across the country. He wrote a letter to 5 clubs to see what sort of feedback he would get. And in the end of March in 1888, on the eve of the cup final, he met with more clubs to sound out opinions. Again, a very positive response. And this led to a final meeting in Manchester at the Royal Hotel on the 17th of April 1888, where it was agreed that the Football League should be formed. And in September of that year, the first matches took place on a glorious sunny afternoon. That league, the idea for which was born here on this unlikely site, went from strength to strength. Within only 5 years, it had grown from 12 to 31 clubs, from 1 division to 2. And McGregor, who ran it, was seen to be one of the most able administrators possible. It was said of him he had no superior, if an equal, in the council chambers of the game. And also, he was not some stuffy administrator, as people often think the Victorians were. He was a man of whom it was said the chief characteristic of Mr. McGregor was the smile on his face and the twinkle in his eye. He was a man who positively radiated joy. William McGregor died in 1911 and was buried here in the graveyard of St Mary's Church in Handsworth. The tributes flowed in. The Birmingham Gazette called him a man of the highest integrity, while the president of the Birmingham County Football Association said he stood for all that was best and cleanest in the great game of football. On the centenary of his death, Aston Villa commissioned the restoration of his grave, which was rededicated at a special service attended by Lord Brian Morwinnie, president of the Football League, and representatives of its founding clubs. It was led by Brian Hall, who was assisted by some of the country's leading clergy. Well, Brian, here we are again. It was a very special day, the 20th of December 2011, wasn't it?
A very memorable occasion, yes. And this man, William McGregor, brought together so many different sorts of people. The whole of the representatives from the football world, as one might expect, the members of the original league. And then there were all the church people that he brought together.
And I think McGregor would have been pleased at what we said about him in respect of his Christian faith.
I hope so. He actually seems to have been a very humble man as well,
yes,
from what I've gathered.
Yes. But McGregor's restored grave isn't the only memorial with which Aston Villa has honoured his memory. In 2009, this impressive bronze statue of him was erected in front of the Trinity Road stand. And today, his influence is still appreciated, as Aston Villa's chaplain Ken Baker explains. Ken, you're a great admirer of William McGregor, aren't you?
Yes, most definitely. He's been a great ambassador for us here, and his name's always mentioned within the club. It's a good club from a spiritual point of view, and it's good to have the William McGregor arrangement with us, because he was an excellent man and a very spiritual man, and people are aware of that, which is good. And whilst he does have a good track record football-wise with this particular club, and as you know, spearheaded many things in the early days, and having won the league 5 times in the 1890s, and so he's a first-class man to have on, I would say, on our books really, and to have the statue at the front of at Villa Park is very good for the club.
What an inspirational man. What a Christian. It's clear that the personal relationship he enjoyed with Christ was the mainspring of all that he did, all that he was. His joy, his integrity, his courage. He was a beacon not only to his generation, but to ours too. Aston Villa can be very proud of this illustrious pioneer.